I am currently sitting in the computer lab in Cambridge, where I have my day job, and some of the time I'm in the Turing Institute in London, where I have my day job, and which is, so I do computer science and AI. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Lilian Edwards to this conversation. I would say fireside chat, but it's too wet out there. We'd never get the fire going. Lilian's a professor in law, innovation and society, and has worked in several places, Newcastle, Strathclyde, Edinburgh, and is very well known in the area of internet law, and in more recent years also in AI and law, and has a number of activities in lots of different places, has contributed papers in some of the top conferences that are relevant to our conversation here. So what we wanted to do was to talk about starting off from I guess the salient fact, which was, aside from the meeting that just happened in Paris about AI, I believe that the EU AI Act has actually now gone live, and so I thought, I believe it's been enacted, or whatever going live with law means in the EU, and so I thought we might talk about what that means. So maybe Lilian, if you could give us a top level of, what is this going to mean for all of us? This rather, what I regard as, when I tried reading it, it was far more nebulous than reading GDPR or the DMA, actually, which seem to be very concrete and have very clear teeth. And with GDPR, we could write privacy impact assessments, and with the DMA, you can start to see people worrying about their having to interoperate and be reasonable in the market. But in contrast, maybe it's harder to interpret the EU AI Act. So maybe you could have a go at where we think we are with it.
Interesting. It's an interesting perspective, that, actually, because what I expected you to say, was that it was much vaguer and more top level in principle than, say, UK legislation, if you were looking at, the DPA 2018. But it's quite interesting to hear you say that it seems much vaguer than the GDPR or the DSA or DMA. That is really quite a finding. Okay, so where are we? It has, as it were, commenced, but the AI Act is a very complex piece of legislation, and it doesn't have to be implemented throughout each member state of the EU in separate legislation, because it is, although they persist in calling it an act, a regulation, which has direct effect. But in reality, many of the members of the European Union are bringing in their own legislation to try and understand it and implement it. So there is obviously a lot going on. There needs to be a transitional phase. And all that has happened so far in February, when the kind of cannons went off. Are we still in February? Yes, this month, it's been going on for the whole of my life, is that the requirement for AI literacy has come into force, which is, in fact, quite important and is getting very little ballyhoo between the Paris AI Summit and will AI kill us all and all the rest of it. It's a very basic recommendation, which is that anyone who is the provider of AI systems, so, OpenAI, Google, all the rest of them, and more importantly, perhaps, anyone who is a deployer of such a system, so all the law firms that are using it as chatbots, all the little vendors on Etsy or whatever that might be using it to help sell their stuff, they have to have a degree of AI literacy. And there has been quite a lot of consternation about what this means. And finally, a bit late, the European communities have put out some guidance, which I have to say I haven't read yet. But it's the usual stuff where it should be commensurate with your size and your risks and so forth and so on. So that is one thing that has happened that almost no one has talked about. The other thing that has happened, which quite a lot of people have talked about, is that the prohibited AI category, as it were, has come into force. And the AI Act is often depicted, this is where I would usually show my slides, as a triangle, right? At the top is the worst stuff, prohibited risk, okay? And primarily, the big fights there were over use of face recognition or biometric identification by the police in public places. You know, that was an enormous fight. And essentially, that is now one of the prohibited practices or systems. Although the devil is in the detail, it has a lot of exceptions. So many that some people have said the exceptions swallow the whole. But that has come into force. And there are some other things in there that may be interesting, that may lead, in fact, are almost starting to lead to litigation about systems that emotionally manipulate you. You know, so you can imagine, I don't know, maybe advertising that in some way reads your image and decides that you would respond best to this thing. I've postulated that it might cover some things like AI girlfriends that talk to you, abuse your vulnerable state as probably young, probably lonely, probably sex-starved, you know, and then tries to maybe sell stuff to you, or maybe tries to sell you a political or ideological allegiance, right? So I think that there are some more interesting things going on there than just the face recognition stuff, which has had so much discussion. Okay, but anyway, that's the top of the little triangle, right? Below that is all what I would say is or was the really important stuff, and that is the regulation of high-risk AI. High-risk AI. Sorry, I'm a bit croaky today. Now that, again, doesn't cover a lot of things that people think of as AI. In fact, it doesn't cover most of them. It doesn't cover search. It doesn't cover recommender algorithms. You know, it doesn't mostly, therefore, cover Amazon and Facebook and all the rest of them, because they're meant to be in the DSA and the DMA. But it is important. It is important. If you look at what's going on in America, for example, it would cover, not that America's covered by the EU AIA, but we can come back to that. It would cover automated hiring, you know? So if Elon Musk sends out emails saying, tell me 5 good things you've done this week, and I'll feed them into ChatGPT and it'll say whether I sat you or not, which is complete garbage, then that would be an automated hiring system, which would fall into the high risk category, which would mean that it had to be built according to what are essentially a set of best practices for building machine learning systems, you know, not just big, large models, but essentially all of what we used to call AI, machine learning, etc., even rule-based systems, okay? And maybe Jon can talk about how useful they are, but they include things like making sure that your training set is not biased, you know, that it's accurate, that it's not full of discriminatory stuff that's been lying around the basement for the last 20 years, like the Amazon hiring system, which someone reminded me today, came out basically wanting to hire men called Chad who played lacrosse, I believe, from their historic hiring data, which is a good one. So, yeah, that's still to come. And that's going to be phased in across its various domains between the end of this year and maybe the end of next year, right? It's going to take a while. Okay, so it's not going to be fully enforced for ages. And there's more stuff I could say. But the other point that is worth making, perhaps, that might lead to Jon thinking it's all a bit airy-fairy, which it is that a lot of it is designed, because it is so complex and controversial, an awful lot of it is designed to be fleshed out by codes of practice, guidance, and especially technical standards. And this is one where I thought Jon might inform me of stuff, because there has been, sorry, I just shouldn't have sounded so surprised at that. You can inform me about stuff any day, Jon. Yeah, the AI Act is built on a paradigm that was designed really for product safety, right back in the 80s. The idea that we need to regulate to say stop unsafe toys being imported, or unsafe refrigerators, okay, or unsafe machinery. And therefore, they built a system whereby the regulations would say you have to do X, P, Y, C, and Q. But what you have to do is self-certify that you have done it against technical standards rather than legislation, because the idea is technical standards can keep up, can be made by the people who understand the industry, can be made by the actual engineers, etc. And you would self-certify against them, and that would get you your pass you know, your little card that said, we're okay, we're safe, and now we can be sold throughout Europe, right? And then there would be consequences down the line, perhaps, if you hadn't done it and your refrigerator blew up and killed several children, right? So at that point, you would switch over to a kind of liability stick, whereas previously you had the carrot of getting a passport to be sold through Europe with no more hassle, okay? Unfortunately or fortunately, this is the model that they kind of stole for the AIA. So the AIA high risk, which, as I say, is the bulk of what really matters to me, apart from one thing, which I better mention and then I'll stop, okay, is to be tested, self-tested, marking your own homework against industry standards, which have not been made yet. They are being made by a European standards group called CEN/CENELEC, okay? Unfortunately, again, perhaps not even ISO or IEEE or one of the ones that people sort of know in America. And it's still rather vague to me how it's going to be ported to these other international standards, because it clearly is going to have to be. But that's where we are. And that's one of the things that is holding it up. They are, in fact, proceeding for Europeans at breakneck speed. I mean, I am on kind of a working group with about 1,000 people on it that's looking at the code of practice for general purpose AI. And the timetable there is ridiculous. It really is. They're just kind of churning stuff out and they keep calling meetings. So that's the last thing I should say, is that was how the AIA was meant to work. And then along came ChatGPT. So they had to add a whole new part about regulating what is called general purpose AI. And whereas the rest had been kind of worked out, you know, to a kind of polish of perfection, almost, you might say. I mean, there had been a lot of discussion. There had been ethical groups. There had been working groups. The GPAI stuff was kind of thrown together and then argued over by lobbying bodies, because this really affected the economics of, you know, major countries. So to me and to a lot of people, I think it's much more messy, right? And that is also not enforced yet, but it has to be enforced relatively soon, which is why the schedule is so mad on the code of practice. Sorry, I should have looked it up. It's something like November this year. It has to be. And they only gave it 9 months to come in. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Thanks very much for the re-summarization. So we had this meeting in Paris, and there've been a whole bunch of these meetings. I mean, going back to some previous British government convening the meeting in Bletchley. And one of the things that the Bletchley meeting highlighted, and that happened in the UK, seemed to be because the UK is insignificant in terms of power, perhaps not in terms of history of AI, but in terms of, you know, being not in the EU, not in China, and not in America. And then obviously Paris is in the EU. France is still in the EU, as far as I remember. And so this is kind of interesting, because not only do we have ChatGPT, we also have Donald Trump. So until let's not talk too much about Donald Trump, but until we had Donald Trump, you had a world where one believed that the Chinese government were some kind of rational actors with optimizing their markets in the whole world. The Americans were some kind of rational actor trying to maximize their market. And Europe was, you know, so they were the three important places, and, you know, followed not very far behind by BRICS, and, you know, Russia and India and Brazil and so on. But they were the three sort of superpowers, and the UK was stuck in the middle. But the more interesting thing, I think, was that the UK at that point was also drafting AI law, which has got stuck, and as you know, the government changed here. And the new government, I don't think, was against the draft AI law, but it was a different kind of law than the EU has put together in the EU AI Act. And the US was also kind of heading for another kind of law, which seemed to be more concerned with the US protecting its businesses. The UK was more concerned with technical safety standards that will be sector specific, as I understand it. Whereas the EU had sort of taken a more broad, all-encompassing set of approaches you've just outlined, some of which are specific and some are more general. So where do we think we are now with how things are going to play? Because, you know, not only has the tech changed, and you've just mentioned with you know, general purpose AI, or generative AI and LLMs and so on, And that, in fact, has changed again in the last 4 weeks because of the massive reduction in costs of training those from DeepSeek and so on. So that's another shift. But also the geopolitics just shifted. So the country that actually owns all the companies that used to make all the really expensive AIs, the US, and now the country that owns a bunch of quite cheap AIs, China, and Europe, which probably has some half-baked AIs around. But we now have all different, with the shifting motives behind what are these laws going to do to the landscape. So there's protecting members of the public, like privacy and GDPR, or protecting the public at large, like anti-monopoly laws. But this is different, right? So this is regulating number of features of software products which interact with technologies that actuate things, that turn on brakes, fire missiles, and trip people over on the stairs, and maybe make your fridge explode, like you said. So so how can we have any sensible discussion about what's going to happen post LLM, DeepSeek, and Trump, or Musk, should I say?
I must say, listening to that, I feel like crawling under my table and putting a tent over my head. I think this is a point in time where actually, no, I think it is very difficult to see a rational outline of what the hell is going on like right now. I mean, so I wish I had a recording of what you just said. I'll make a couple of scatter point. Well, we do have a recording of what you've just said, but I won't get to hear it this second. What we need is some of that real-time in-meeting, dictation, note-taking stuff, and I could be looking at it going TikTok along the floor. Okay, a random set of points, which please take with a grain of salt, because I think all of this history will be conflicted when it comes to be written down properly, which I hope it will be. So I can only speak from my own anecdata as much as what's come out in documents, okay? Because a lot of this is who said, what said, who said, and then a lot of protocol. When the UK had the first AI Safety Institute conference, right, which was 2 years ago, yeah? We had that one, then we had, Korea?
Yep.
Then we had Paris. So the world was very different, right? 2 years ago, we were, just beginning to embark onto general purpose AI. And everyone was gaga about it, and it looked new and shiny and wonderful. And the economic situation wasn't quite as dire. And I think, pure anecdata, that Rishi Sunak did see a nice opportunity for the UK to intervene there, as it were, between kind of the horrors of the over-regulation, as industry saw it, of the EU AI Act and the DSA and the DMA and the GDPR, and what they wanted, what the US wanted, which has always historically been laissez-faire capitalism, leave us alone, let us get on with it, move fast and break things, including laws. Okay, now that had shifted a bit under Biden and Harris. There is another version of that story, which is it wasn't just about the UK seeing economic opportunity, but about Rishi Sunak seeing a nice job in Silicon Valley, when, as everyone knew, he was going to be thrown out as Prime Minister. The net fallout was that first summit was a bit captured, it seemed to me. If that was the aim, if the aim was to promote industry at the same time as having a vision for an inclusive, not too biased, not too discriminatory society, because we're Britain, we have the rule of law, all these things were mentioned. It was also slightly captured by the glamour, I think, of the AI doomers, as I call them, as of the AI will kill us all. The rise of AGI, artificially intelligent general intelligence, etc. And so a huge amount of the discourse around that first forum, it seemed to me, was actually not very relevant to any of the things people were actually worried about, which were A, how do we make money out of this? you know, B for Europe and the UK. How on earth do we get into this gold mine? Because our AI industries are streets behind the US and increasingly even streets behind China, you know, coming up on the inside lane. And the other thing I think people were worried about, you know, looking more at the civil society kind of EU end, was how are we going to stop the current harms of AI? Right, you know, which everyone knew quite a lot about by then. You know, a few I've already mentioned, the fact that they enable historic bias, that they enable discrimination in hiring, that they, you know, enable ubiquitous surveillance, that they spread disinformation, you know, that they allow the targeting and segmentation of the entire population in ways that are not pleasant. Okay, so we already knew 8,000 things that weren't very good about machine learning stroke AI. So this, to me, was what should have been discussed on the table, right? That balance between fixing all the current societal harms emerging from machine learning stroke AI and, you know, creating innovation and growth for prosperity and human flourishing and all the rest of it, right? That should have been the argument. And instead, what we had was a lot of pontificating about whether AI would kill us all. And I truly don't really understand that. I mean, I think some of it, John might know, was driven by defense concerns, like, you know, would these AIs go off and start creating bioweapons that no one had ever thought of? I didn't really understand any of that. So anyway, that's where we were, okay? And now, if you roll on 2 years to the Paris summit, it was plain that after 2 years of sort of concentrating on these existential threats, Paris had decided to reel it back in and have what they called an AI action summit, which would have taken action to deal with the issues I've just talked about, you know, the balance between innovation and making money and current harms, right? And that all sounded great on paper. But then the international world order fell apart. Almost as this was happening, right? And now what you have, it seems to me, is what looks like a very empty vessel, a bit like the General Assembly, perhaps, as opposed to the Security Council, you know, saying we're worried about X, Y, and Z, and let's put out a slightly anodyne press release because they were trying not to irritate Vance, who had just come to Europe and torn a strip off everybody in an extremely unpleasant way. You know, how on earth is this consortium that's thinking about, you know, the interests of Europe, the interests of the globe, the interests of society, the interests of the marginalized, how's it going to say anything to Trump and Musk, who clearly don't care? You know, they're now selling AI as if it was real estate. In fact, they're selling everything as if it was real estate and buying it as if it was real estate, you know, from AI to Greenland, so to Ukraine. So that's where I see it right now, is I have to say very chaotic. And I cannot imagine, maybe if you come in on all that, John, and then I could maybe come back to what we're going to do about legislation. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's a bit disappointing when you go back to what used to be called FAT, but for political correctness reasons got renamed FACT, a bit like NeurIPS used to be called NIPS, and then it got changed to NeurIPS.
Don't mention these things.
But these things were a few years back, came out of programs of looking at AI and saying, but long before generative AI, LLMs, and so on, and AGI. Well, AGI is a very old idea, but before anyone was trying to claim that we had technology that could be made sustainable and explainable. And those two things are quite important, because small systems like the software in your phone that recognizes people, and you're taking a picture and tags them because you've already tagged previously that person. This is a face recognition system, but those systems can actually be jigged to be explainable and say what were the features in that image that made it say it was this person, not that person. And those are used in medical imaging to say what are the features on this retinal scan or this lung scan or whatever that say we're diagnosing this, and why, because of previous cases labeled by surgeons or whatever. And with what probability, you know, with some sort of uncertainty. None of those systems are any more than slightly sophisticated neural nets, deep learning, convolutional neural nets, a few layers, but they're very affordable. In fact, part of the way you make them explainable also allowed you to make them much smaller and sparser, which means they are very cheap to run once they've been trained, and they're quite cheap to train compared with the sort of larger language model stuff. So that whole line of work was what most people would mainly use in image data, which is what looks smart. Even in creating images, even actually figuring out how you use stable diffusion to create new images, you need to scan the images too and then find features. The other kind of data that most people use is what's called tabular data, which most people are familiar with because it shows up in a spreadsheet. And it's a table, there's sort of rows and columns, and you can add things up. And this is a very old profession of accountancy, which includes uncertainty quantification. You're allowed to have small errors. And it also includes ordnance, which is sort of aiming weapons, because you look at the distance to the enemy and the wind direction and the weight of your shells, and you figure out how far they go. And these things are 150 years old and predate any form of AI, but they are machine learning because you learn how to improve the equations in practice. And again, they're explainable. You can say why you're doing these things. And you can, when you say something to somebody like, we will or won't give you a loan, or we will or won't hire you, you can go back through the rows and columns, or you can go back through the neural net and say, these were the features. And that entire line of work was pursued by lots of researchers in North America, Canada, US, in the Explainable AI DARPA program, in European research labs, the Turing Institute, a whole bunch of stuff on all kinds of ways of doing this sort of counterfactual explanations. Or anyway, so that line of work would actually address a lot of the real interesting things in everyday life where you might just want to use AI with a goal, something that fits a business model, something you had a bunch of people, rows and rows of people, like in the movie Brazil, at desks with weird devices. You would replace their boring jobs, their soul-destroying jobs, with this computation, which had already been done to a large extent, but you could make it explainable as well, and you could automate it, and then we could do with some of those things that people worry about. So I think the technical side has unfortunately, what was supposed to happen in Paris maybe was to revisit those sorts of things, to say, well, we can allow these things, provided even if you're self-regulating, provided part of your self-regulation is that you publish the fact you've checked these things, or a third party has checked them and says, yeah, you've debiased your system. So the NIST US standards organization, for example, is publishing not just how to debias your face recognition system, actually how to interoperate face recognition systems and other biometrics. And those are based in these understandable systems, which is quite interesting. So there was a whole line of work, which is still ongoing, but it could have delivered some useful technical tools to help with some of these middle ground, everyday things that would impact people much more frequently than some, distant risk of the Skynet disaster scenarios of the robot overlords taking over society and deciding to kill all humans for some weird reason, which I've never understood. Anyone who thinks that is the story of Terminator.
Conversation about that.
Yeah, no, it's people don't read the science fiction and know the endings. But I think your point is the question here is for the common cases, we might really be able to address some of those middle ground things that the EU AI Act wants to do. And probably what was thought about in the UK's AI safety law that was proposed, I can't remember the Lord who proposed it, and he's still working on it for the new government.
Lord Holmes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that story is slightly more nuanced about the UK. Shall I go into that?
Yeah, please.
And again, I might be wrong. Okay, there's been a number of bills proposed about AI in Parliament over the last X years, some under the Tories and now some under Labour. Some of the good ones have come more or less from independent lords, like Tim Clement-Jones, who used to be a partner in DLA Piper and really knows his stuff, and Lord Holmes, our blind lord, who has taken obviously a great deal of useful advice, and they are both really good bills. Okay, Now, the government's bills, as I understand it, both the old Tory government and the new shiny Starmer government, are not really the same thing. There are bits of overlap, but both have really majored on, as law, as hard law, doing something that looks pretty simple and to me kind of a bit pointless, actually, which is putting our AI Safety Institute, now renamed the AI Security Institute. That was another Paris development for everything that said safety, which meant AGI, risk, AI doomers, existential stuff. That's been crossed out and replaced with AI security. And this is why, again, the picture is more complex, unfortunately, than just sensible machine learning with a toolkit of safeguards that we've understood quite well since about 2016 and crazy AGI doomer stuff, because we now have a kind of spectrum from machine learning where we can build to some extent explicability and so forth, through large language models or large models where it's much harder. And again, I defer back to my technical peers here, but it seems to me it's just that much harder to produce anything rational out of them, because all you have is weights, and all you know is it decided that, you know, that weight was nearer that weight than that weight, or something like that, you know, and there really isn't a lot of rationality to it. So in my head, I think of it as rule-based, then machine learning, then large models, and practically all bets are off. And then, you know, we've got the use of that kind of technology for security, whatever that means, which seems to mean national security as opposed to safeguarding your house or safeguarding your car or your IoT. And then you've still got AGI hanging on the edge of the cliff. So these are all different interests, right? So it seems like at the moment, the UK AI Security Institute seems to have pivoted heavily to actual national security. Now, whether that's product of realizing that we're not going to be able to influence the US, maybe it's money, maybe it's Ukraine, I don't really know. It's all a bit weird. I would personally have rather seen it pivot backwards, if you like, in the direction of dealing with the basics that Jon was talking about, you know, trying to make every day hiring, firing, welfare distribution, tax systems, health systems, triage systems, border control systems. These are all in the AI high risk category. They've got them right. Just making them work better, you know, finding ways to make them safe, accountable, transparent, explainable, you know, which is, like Jon's been saying, been ongoing work forever. But instead, they seem to have planked themselves down in this territory, which again is a bit more glamorous maybe, and which I think Turing's already covering a lot of. So that also confuses me, about national security and defense. So we will see. Also, they've hired an awful lot of people whose specialities are possibly no longer relevant. You know, what's going to happen to them? I mean, I happen to know one person who was hired just before all this happened to, you know, major on making AI safety more like protecting the little man, if you know what I mean, the basic stuff. And what's he going to do? You know, he's not an expert in national security. So that's the point. So yeah, in terms of legislation, I think all we were ever going to see, actually, mandatory legislation that makes you do things, was putting the AISI, whatever it stands for, on a statutory basis, so that it has like powers and is a public body and things like that, right? Because we don't like untidiness of unelected bodies sitting around. We had the same kind of problems with the Internet Watch Foundation. But the old government, the Tories, wanted to use our existing regulators, the Information Commissioner, the CMA, the FCA, all these people who are doing a very good job actually on the digital front. They just really wanted business as usual. They wanted them to talk to each other more and develop some shared capacity and some shared resources, you know, and that didn't really get you a lot further. You know, it wasn't evil, but it wasn't anything comparable to the leap of faith that the EU AI Act was. And it seemed, sorry, technical phrase, really silly to me, because any UK company building something resembling AI that falls into the high-risk AI categories will want to sell into Europe. as our biggest, nearest trading partner. And that means that they become subject to the EU AIA, and they will have to meet its needs anyway, right? Or they aren't going to get to do that selling, right? So without all the politics, it's always seemed to me that the absolute obvious thing for the UK to do was align itself with the AIA. And it has very doggedly chosen not to do that because Brexit, because taking back control. And also, to be fair, because we think we can be in this place, the new Singapore, deregulated between EU and the US. But it just doesn't work. I can't understand how it can work unless we cease trading with Europe. And certainly that isn't going to happen now. And that's why it's almost impossible for the Starmer government to decide what to put into a new bill. And at the moment, they're probably only going to do what they committed to doing in the manifesto, which is exactly the same as what the Tories committed to, which is putting the AISI on a statutory basis. So don't hold your breath for UK AI legislation.
Right. Yeah, I believe they did kick it into the sort of at least 6 months out just a couple of days ago. So that looks like it's what you just said. Sounds like the right interpretation of what's happening. The defense thing is kind of interesting. So one of the things that the DeepSeek, or DeepSeek as I refer to it, is DeepSeek's OpenAI's valuation. One of the things that one of my venture capitalist friends points out was that the LLM companies, well, the startups in that space, had evaluations which were based in the number of H100 NVIDIA GPUs that they needed. And what DeepSeek did was say that valuation was nonsense, and everyone should have said it was nonsense, and that actually you can do with between 10 or 100 or possibly 1,000 times less hardware. And what that's done is rebalance the innovation space, the entry to the AI world, to say, actually, you can train a large model for around 5 billion for the initial training, for the real full training. You can then go about the refinements or just inference using that mixture of experts-based system. We've known that for 2 years. In fact, Lilian, you were in a very nice seminar at the Turing Institute where the Hugging Face CEO pointed out that they just had Llama, the first version of Llama released by Meta, and that did all of this already, but nobody paid much attention because it was just open source and it wasn't Chinese. But now we have this, and why this matters to the defense people. I had this conversation with my venture capitalist friend. He's saying, well, okay, now we've readjusted all this valuation, but also what we realize is we're now back to this asymmetric warfare. And asymmetric warfare, both metaphorically in the market, which is new entrants like China in terms of technology, relatively new, can do this coming up in the, catch up in the fast lane and overtake. But so can lots of other people, and you don't know who they are. Now, in literal warfare, this is a bit like the Yemeni Houthis building $300 drone missiles. This is really problematic when the American defense companies are selling them for anywhere between $100,000 and $10 million. And then there's this bunch of people who are building these things. But they also do this for hybrid warfare. And this is why I think the pivot happened from safety to security, driven by the UK, where I know the UK defense, I don't work in defense because I don't have clearance, but I know some of the people working in it. And I think they are quite responsible. Technically, they actually do want to build better defensive systems, so they appreciate that the other side could be 3 people. It doesn't have to be a state actor. It doesn't have to be the Red Army in some big building in Beijing or the Kremlin or wherever. And the problem is that the combination of a drone attack and an misinformation attack has been demonstrated both in Ukraine and Gaza. So the hybrid warfare is here, and the hybrid warfare does not take a lot of resources, and that's really scary for people, because essentially you take out the data center that's running the national news agencies at the same time as flooding all the social media channels with misinformation about not only what's going on but whatever. And this has happened multiple times in both those wars, and it's the first time you actually see this outside of sci-fi books. And it's not AGI, Terminator coming to get us, and Skynet falling. It's it's the better sci-fi where people tell the story of the messy world that we're moving into. So I think that's why the defense people have made a grab on this, because they actually are genuinely worried and thinking about what tools they need to defend countries or mitigate those attacks anyway. So I think that is a genuine problem. The fact that you can get a few $1,000s will buy you a system where you could train up a mixture of expert like system on all the data you need, then generate lots of misinformation in any language. You don't care if it's Ukrainian or it's Korean or it's Hungarian or or American English or whatever, and it's convincing. And then you do that at the same time you fire up a few hundred of your $300 drones and blow up some stuff. So I think that's a genuine concern. The data is out there. It's been observed. It's not secret. I'm not, I don't have clearance. I'm not telling you stuff that you can't find out. But it's a genuine worry. But as you say, it doesn't actually talk to the problem of the alignment is not in the AI. For the UK, the alignment should be with the EU. If we wanted our relatively respectable AI technology companies to be able to sell products through the supply chain in the same way we stayed aligned. I mean, I will note that post-Brexit, quietly, we stayed aligned with university research funding, with in fact all research funding, and with the food safety standards, because otherwise we couldn't import and export food. Well, gosh. And so
I think we kept quite a lot of the environmental standards as well, actually, despite all the ballyhoo. I mean, we haven't even mentioned environments. Can I ask a couple of questions about the defense stuff? Because this is really interesting to me, because I don't know any of it. I mean, we have seen cheap information warfare for years, of course, since the turn of the millennium, because the internet is cheap and accessible to everybody. And we all know that, the disinformation wave that swept the Western world and possibly, enabled Trump the first time around, came from Moldovan teenagers, not at all politically inclined, but making money from grabbing eyeballs and putting adverts next to them, right? So, I mean, this reminds me a bit of a really good science fiction novel, which no one mentions in these conversations, which is Europe in Autumn by Dave Hutchinson, which is about a completely fissioned Europe in which nation states have kind of lost the plot, really, and everything from football teams to long railway lines are now acquiring semi-sovereign status and kind of fighting each other, and then there's a kind of James Bond outfit that works across the borders. It's tremendous. Apparently it's finally coming to TV, and I recommend it to everybody. So I suppose the aligned question is, why do we expect this incredibly cheap technology only to be wielded by China or Russia or Korea or India? Why couldn't it be anybody? Why couldn't it be me who's pissed off at Edinburgh Airport right now? Is this not going to be, sorry, that's probably a Section 127 Communications Act offence. Are we worried about the disintegration into splintered guerrilla, non-attributed warfare more than people are letting on? Because all the Americans seem to be scared of is China. China. And that's all that's driving everything right now. It's complete madness.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But anyway, I think we should back away from that discussion slightly.
Are we going to be taken away in bans?
No. I mean, I think it's really useful to put it on the table and think about that, as you say. It's a real thing. European society's got lots of complicated bonds that hold it together, and then every now and then turn into world wars. But we'll see.
But we've never been in a position where non-nation state actors could really exert physical as well as information harm. That's what you've just said. That is a really interesting point.
I think it's problematic. And in the meantime, it's these kind of threats, like earlier on, the crazy threat is China, and then now this kind of threat are masking the work that should go on, which is, if we do manage to keep society going in as a reasonably civilized way, we have to deal with all these day-to-day, biases, a well-known list of problems, which are mostly mitigatable with a little bit of extra effort, and then allow you to realize the value. And in some cases, the UK is sitting on the patient records of 70 million people cradle to grave. We have the best database with gene pool diversity in the world. And there are awesome things can be and are being done with that. I mean, the Oxford Open Safety Project that Ben Goldacre runs is already contributing cool things. And there are other things happening slowly but surely. But you really
to be craft.
Yeah.
Are we in such a terrible economic state that we're basically going to give, if not control, then access to and ways to control this data to companies based primarily in the US, and without really pushing that, it brings you back to problem number one, which is what is the point in us learning how to do great stuff with AI safety, security? I'd rather call it something else, really. We need to think of another word that doesn't have all this baggage. Fairness, accountability, and transparency. Let's go back to that one. When the tools that people are using are still primarily based in a jurisdiction which is almost certainly not going to recognize these laws or norms and is perhaps going to forbid them. I mean, what about Trump's anti-diversity laws? I mean, I have seen an executive order which appears to close down any university research into un-American AI, non-DEI AI work on diversity. I mean, it's remarkable whether anyone will pay any attention to it, but they're already going to lose their funding. So, that takes you to, I mean, you could talk about this for 19 hours. That takes you to whether there is any hope for UK or EU digital sovereignty. The last couple of papers I saw on this were extremely mournful.
I think one thing to remember is that AI software is not the complexity, it's the data that's complexity. And most of the software itself is open source. And we have those tools. And remember, Europe invented Linux and the ARM processor. And it's only a sort of weird fact that, Amazon, AWS, and Microsoft Azure are American companies. It's sort of bizarre that we didn't have those. We could have built all of that with entirely European-based technology companies.
But that's it. We need European cloud or UK cloud. And right now we have almost none, do we? I mean, the most fun suggestion I've seen this week is that we pivot to building our cloud infrastructure through Lidl. Apparently Lidl have got a really great sovereign cloud set up, and it just needs to be expanded because indeed Dieter Schwartz is a kind of crazy digital fundamentalist.
Yeah. So actually, concretely, the first big customer for the Zen hypervisor, which is what Amazon's based on, was actually, before it became part of Amazon, was Tesco's. And Tesco's virtualized their entire, so they created a cloud as well. So it doesn't surprise me Lidl's are the same. But then the question is, they're running AI presumably on all their customers' preferences and loyalty cards, which is entirely a good relationship if it's made transparent, if you have agency and you have all of that, because they get you recommends you want. So this is okay, and they're not publishing your data either.
I'm more inclined to trust Lidl in Germany than I am any operator in the US, not because they're bad people, but because Trump will just steam in and take the data if he wants to. And also because there just isn't going to be any effective guardrail laws. I mean, they've already repealed the Biden-Harris executive order. They're probably going to dismantle NIST and the US ISI tomorrow.
By the way, I'm on an email list for NASA, North American Space Agency, because I worked on some projects for them. And I just got the email from them with the presidential order explaining that they can no longer use the ED&I thing for hiring astronauts. So they're picking people to go to the space station. Anyway, I mean, it would be amusing if it wasn't, desperate.
I know. So.
Yes, thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. I was thinking that there is also another discourse probably going on. But it used to be AI for making a lot of money for profit. Then there was a lot of interest in AI for good, social good, public good, environmental good. And then now it seems like most recently it's to do with more AI in the public interest. So I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts about on what that means? What AI in the public interest means? Is it AI? I mean, ensuring that AI is safe, transparent, secure, whatever, or do we have actually more to explore there?
I'm actually surprised, possibly heartened, to hear that question, because I can't think of any country right now that is primarily interested in AI in the public interest. And I wonder where you mean. I suppose the nearest is Europe.
I think it came up
Britain is all about growth and the US is all about money. And China, I'm not sure. Yeah, so I'm curious which you meant, sorry.
No, it came up in this US UN General Assembly, the Global Compact, and then it came in the UK's latest publication on AI, sort of UK's AI vision, that there is this phrase that says it's AI in the public interest that we are trying to, we are aiming for. But never mind. I mean, if it doesn't directly.
I feel a bit like saying they would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, the place that is possibly most likely to develop AI in the public interest is actually China, which we never talk about. If you look back at the Chinese legislation that's been ongoing for a long time, first they did legislation on recommender algorithms, they had a draft AI law, which I don't know if it's actually come out, then they did deep fakes, synthetic stuff, and then they did general purpose AI, right? And these are really interesting, comprehensive pieces of legislation, which involve things like licensing the models, the large models that are produced in China, right? To check if they meet kind of socialist goals. They talk about things like human flourishing, and socialist values. And then everyone at this point like sighs and goes, well, it's rubbish. It will never be enforced. I don't know. They may be enforcing it, but for the wrong reasons, because it is widely said that the Chinese state is using these laws to try to keep its private tech sector in check, right? But maybe that still means they're doing something good.
Yeah, we got funded in Cambridge to have, joint with Manchester, a doctoral training program for 50 PhDs a year for the next few years, which is in AI for decision support and making explainable decision systems. And one of the areas there is things like supporting inclusivity and direct democracy, so that instead of having elected people for 5 years make a bunch of decisions, everyone gets involved. So there actually are some system things going on which actually are addressing these kinds of things. A couple of very helpful people have put links in the chat, by the way, if you haven't seen them, which look salient to this discussion. And then since we've got like 1 minute left, I think that's
I wasn't saying it didn't exist. There is an enormous civil society that is still working for AI for good, AI for public interest. I went to RightsCon in Costa Rica last year. It was inspiring, really. It's on in Taipei this year. There is a vast amount of work going on. I just don't think any major, huge AI producing state right now has frankly got public interest at the heart of its interest. Sadly, right. It's certainly balancing it.
Right. I mean, I'd say some of the people working in the UK and French, actually, I know the AI program in healthcare, where we have state-run healthcare systems, which are very effective, cost-effective, but also very good technically. And people are putting AI in the loop, not big AI. They're using basically statistics automated. But this is, I think, promising and largely for the good, but it's very quiet. It doesn't have, it's just improving healthcare in the same way that better, cleanliness improves things, in a way. So if you
only hear about it when they say it means that we can get by with only 2 radiologists for the rest of the entire hospital, and that's rubbish. One of my best friends is a radiologist.
Actually, it's funny you say that, because the number of people that are going to be checking mammograms will decrease as they increase the use of AI. Although actually, it's possible that the number of checks will go up, so the total number of people involved might stay the same. But we'll see. But I think those are kind of
the product. I mean, but that's what Barbara said. She said, people who say these tools will replace radiologists, do you not think we're using these tools already? And as this stuff rolls out, they just use it to try and deal with more and more work with less people.
That's the risk, isn't it? Okay, we covered a lot of territory there, but I'm conscious you have another thing to go to.
I've got to go.
But thanks so much for the input from the legal side, and maybe we could rerun this a year from now or 5 years from now and see what's happened to this landscape. It's sort of changing so fast. I feel like we might need to run it 3 weeks from now.
Yeah, I'd be willing to run it again in 6 months, actually. I mean, a year, geez. We could all be dead. But that was really interesting.
Okay. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone
Thanks for the
attending.
invite.
Thank you.